But today I'm actually just going to be talking about the Casebooks project. And our goal there is to encode the surviving medical records of Simon Forman and Richard Napier, arguably the most popular astrologer-physicians of the late Elizabethan and Jacobean ages. And you can see that's Forman on the left, that's Napier on the right. And it's hard to imagine two more different personalities. Forman came from a relatively unprivileged background. He was largely self-educated. He was combative, boastful, and by his own account, sexually rapacious. Napier, in contrast, was sober, chaste, and withdrawn. He studied theology at Oxford and occupied the rectorship of Great Linford in Buckinghamshire from 1590 until his death in 1634. Now, somehow these two men established a very unlikely friendship, and the first recorded encounter between them was on the 22nd of June in 1597, and that was when Napier sought Forman's advice about some goods that had been stolen from him. And as I said, they obviously had established some sort of rapport, since shortly afterwards, Napier began to practice astrology under Forman's tutelage. And they became lifelong friends, frequently corresponding and visiting one another, helping each other out with their medical practice, and sometimes even collaborating on cases. And it's important to note that while their contemporaries may have been increasingly more likely to dismiss astrology and astrological medicine as a superstitious practice and their practitioners as charlatans, it was still a valid form of practice for many. And Forman and Napier certainly did not consider themselves charlatans. They each clearly believed in the efficacy of their own methods. And this is evidenced perhaps most strikingly by the fact that each man was their own best client. Forman cast charts to find out what had become of his missing garters or what his prospects for a sexual conquest were. And Napier cast charts to find out why he repeatedly lost to his curate at cards or why he did not experience the accustomed sense of divine grace at prayer. As far as today is concerned, what's actually important about their practice is that they both kept meticulous records of their consultations. And although most of the records for Forman's earlier practice have been lost, their surviving casebooks, which are housed today within the Bodleian Library at Oxford, are voluminous. They comprise 64 volumes covering a 40-year span from 1596 to 1634. They amount to over 14,000 pages, contain an approximately 80,000 cases, involving an estimated 40 to 60,000 unique individuals. And this makes them one of the most extensive surviving sets of private medical records in history. And here you've got a sample page there, and I'll actually go in a little more detail about it, since I'm sure it all makes perfect sense to everybody as you look at it. From a research perspective, the casebooks are a treasure trove of information. And because of the horary nature of their analyses, Forman and Napier needed to note the date and time of each of their consultations. They almost always recorded their patient's name, from which their sex can usually be inferred. They also usually recorded their age, the nature of their inquiry, and their approximate address. In the case of Forman, it's usually a part of London. In the case of Napier, it was usually a town or village around Buckinghamshire. They also included information about the occupations and social, familial, or professional relationships between the individuals mentioned in the case. And their consultations weren't one-to-one affairs between a patient and his or her consultant. Cases often involved multiple patients. And it was also common for other people to be involved as well. Often, the patient wasn't the one asking a question of the astrologer. It was someone else, whom as we call the querent, and there could be any number of them as well. So cases could contain any number of individuals asking questions of any number of other individuals, all in one case with one chart, filling one little grid there. So, I promised I'd give you a little bit of an explanation on this, and I'll try to be brief because this actually isn't my forte. And what you've actually been looking at is a page from one of Foreman's notebooks. It's Ashmole 228, folio 204 recto, and thought run through what you'd see here. So you can see that the full page is displayed on the left in a thumbnail, and then on the right you can see it's been zoomed in and divided into 4 quadrants that we've labeled A, B, C, and D. These 4 little divisions here represent the 4 major classes of information presented within the case. Section A usually contains the question and personal information about the patient. B is the chart of the heavens at the moment at which the question was asked. C is the astrologer's judgment on the case. And then D is any extra information that would have been included along with the case. So up there in A, in the very first line, it actually starts to read, Elizabeth Hartwell of Astwood, once Mr. Uvedale's servant, 25 years, unmarried, hath clumpers of blood in her mouth, 15th DA, then Saturn symbol, which is Saturday, hour 1:15, 1599. So we've got there the name of the patient, it's Hartwell. Her address is Astwood, which is a small village about 10 miles from Napier's Place. She was a servant to Mr. Uvedale, that's a relation, which we've got coded. 25 years old, another bit of information we encoded. She suffered from blood clots, topic. Her question was asked on a Saturday on the 15th of September, 1599 at 1:15 in the afternoon. Again, date and time. Beneath all this in B, you'll see the astrological chart, which is calculated for the time the question was asked. Then C, you'll see this is where the astrologer wrote his judgment. And here we learned that Hartwell had been in bed for a week with fever. It's caused by the malign influence of Mars. Those around her, and it's not clear who they were, suspected that it was pleurisy or an impost, and feared that she would die. Then towards the end of the entry, down in section D, we find that Napier prescribed 3 sorts of purges, a cooling tincture, and he waived the fee for his time. And this page here is very typical of Foreman's entries. They followed this almost strictly, this division of the case into these 4 sections. And he physically also tended to divide the page into 4 separate quadrants, A, B, C, and D. So we have a very clear, uniform set of records that Foreman created. And Napier, for the most part, started out using the same format himself, degenerated a bit over time as he became more comfortable in his own abilities as a practitioner. He became much more free-form in how he recorded the information. But despite the variance in their structure, the data that was contained within them was the same. And Hartwell's case actually just illustrates a tiny fraction of the different bits of information that we encode on the cases. And at last count, we have over 348 topics arranged under 11 broad categories. We have the facilities to record details about the various parties involved in the case, and, when available, whether the question was asked with the knowledge and consent of the patient. In addition to noting the presence of treatment, recipe, or notes about payment, we also record information about events relevant to the case, such as the condition of the patient's urine, or Napier's reliance on angelic device when formulating his diagnosis or prognosis. We also encode the presence of explicit information about items brought or sent to the consultation, such as urine or blood samples, letters, as well as where the practitioner was relative to the querent at the time of the consultation. Namely, did the practitioner visit the querent? Did the querent come to the practitioner? Did they meet on neutral ground? Or do we have no idea where they actually met? So as you can likely imagine here, as you see this, and you've heard me rattle off a lot of the data we encode, that we faced a lot of challenges figuring out how to deal with this. The ones that are most relevant for today were basically how we decided how we were going to code this information, how we ensure this accuracy, and then how we're hoping to explore the rich interconnections that are present within these volumes. And the first challenge, as I mentioned, was deciding what data to record and how to model it. And producing a complete edition of the casebooks would have been a vast undertaking, demanding the dedication of several academic careers. And given the project's financial and logistical constraints, it also wasn't something that was feasible. So we were faced with the prospect of having to sample the records in some fashion. That either meant transcribing a small subsection of the cases in their entirety, or choosing instead to transcribe portions of each case, but to cover the entire volume, the entire collection. And we chose the latter approach. And part of the reason for this decision was because of the nature of the entries themselves. They lent themselves to producing excerpts of the cases, but also it was partly our research ambitions. While sampling portions of the entire collection may enable you to say how many 26-year-old women might have been interested in pregnancy, only our approach would allow you to actually find all the women that were interested in pregnancy as individuals. It would only be our approach that would allow you to find Judith Clark, who's actually person 1778. There's Judith Clark, there's 1778, who was a 36-year-old woman who first came to Foreman in the spring of '96. And she was inquiring not only about her pregnancy, but also as to whether her husband, who was away on voyage, was alive or dead. And she was evidently worried about both her absent husband and her pregnancy, since she returned to ask many questions on both over the coming months. Evidently, the husband did come back because they both showed up towards October of that year, asking a question about one of their 4-year-old children, of how she was doing. And over the course of the next 4 years, Judith came back over a dozen times, asking a variety of questions, most involving her children, one of whom was Anne, who was very likely the child she was carrying when she first visited Foreman. So we like to think that the advantage of our approach is that it allows you to actually follow individuals, trace the connections between these individuals, and get an appreciation for the real experiences that these people had suffering from their conditions and their concerns. So the question then became how we were going to encode this information. And at this point, I have to acknowledge that our mandate wasn't to create a website for accessing the case books. It's actually to create a data set that is as robust and future-proof as possible. And for this reason, we chose to encode all our data in XML using the Text Encoding Initiative's guidelines, along with a few custom extensions. And there's just a little bit of pointy brackets there to scare people. I don't go into detail because it usually causes most people to glaze over. And the reason we chose TEI is for several reasons, actually. First of all, it's ubiquitous within humanities computing and digital humanities circles. Secondly, it's a very robust and very mature approach to encoding historical documents. And thirdly, is that their schema is very flexible, and it allows for a very expressive form of XML. And it was this expressivity that was actually the key reason we decided to go for it. When we do our transcriptions, we're not just transcribing metadata that you saw, we're also producing a diplomatic transcription of those textual bits I was describing. So when you saw the Saturn symbol up there, we don't just say that it was Saturday. We transcribe a Saturn symbol there. We say that Saturn symbol is actually an abbreviation. That Saturn symbol actually is an abbreviation for Saturday. When there's a deletion, we mark it as a deletion. We mark how it was deleted, struck through, canceled, excised as possible. We haven't encountered it yet. If something's an addition, we note that it's an addition. We mark where it's added. If we know by whom, we say whose hand it is. So we go for very rich diplomatic transcriptions. The other advantage of TEI's expressiveness is that it allows us to deal with the very weird edge cases that we tend to encounter. And these are where you get bits of information that would have trouble fitting into a more structured database unless you knew they existed when you designed it in the first place. So one advantage of it allows us to deal with is if we know that a case took place at 1 p.m. on the 15th or 16th of March, 1660, which is an example from case 10138. Or another example where we don't precisely know who the querent is, as was the case in case 1019, where we don't know whether it was Catherine Pyborn or an unidentified individual asking about Catherine's health. There's case 29081, which involves Joan Andrews, who was either asking about her own faintness or she was asking about her child, who she feared was suffering from consumption. And finally, this is one that I love just for the perversity of its complexity, and it's Lady Cheney's birth. And Lady Cheney is person 19271, and her birth was the 25th of either January or February 1560, sometime between 6 or 7 in either the morning or the evening. And while this could be accommodated within a database structure, you would have had to have known this sort of thing existed in advance. And this gets us to why we chose this approach. Nobody knows what's in these cases. Nobody has read them through from start to finish chronologically, as near as we can determine, for centuries. You've had historians who've gone through them looking for names or concepts, such as A.L. Rouse has done. You've got other historians, Mike Donald, Ronald Sayer, who've done statistical sampling of small sections of them, but nobody has sat down and read these things from start to finish. And that means we have to be prepared for the fact that we are going to be surprised by things we can't anticipate and things that are going to break our approach. And it's actually a fairly common occurrence. It's getting less and less common as we go further through the corpus. But to give you an idea, one thing we're currently actually dealing with is investigating completely changing how we're recording all topics. As I mentioned, Foreman's was a very rigid structure, and his language for describing the topics of the consultations was also quite constrained. Napier was much more fluid in how he described conditions and much more verbose. And we're starting to find that Napier's language is starting to push against the limits of what we can accommodate now. And so we're actually investigating recording all question topics in the form of logical triples. That is, statements containing a subject, a predicate, and an object. This would be something along the lines of condition, affects, part of the body, thing. The other advantage to using XML is that we can employ robust accuracy checks to ensure the validity of not only the structure of our files, but also the data they record. And most of these tests are run while the transcribers are working. And amongst other things, they constrain the contents or values that certain elements and attributes can contain. The data for these tests is actually all derived from external authority files, all coded in XML themselves, which are maintained by the editors. And these are tests that right now mean that if our editors are saying this topic is passions, we know that passions is a valid topic because it goes to the topics file as they're transcribing, and if it can't find it there, it screams. And we run tests like this for pretty well everything, relations, you name it. But what's I'm particularly happy with and what I quite like is that they actually test the underlying logic of the data. So when I said that tested relations, it not only would test to say, but if we say X is the father of Y, It doesn't just check to see if father is a valid relation. It actually knows, because the authority file is defined it that way, that father is a male, has to be male. And if X has not been defined as male within the file, it will scream because something is wrong. Either the person himself has been misidentified, the relation name is wrong, or they've put the pointers in the wrong bits. But in either case, it throws up an error that says something has gone amiss within this file. But the final challenge that we face is actually figuring out how to explore the rich interconnections contained within the cases themselves. And we already offer search and visualization facilities, and I'm just going to quickly describe what you're seeing here. Doesn't really need that much. This is our search form right now, and it's a very blunt force form of searching, where you can search date, time, names, querent demographics. You can search them by their age, by their sex. Same for the patient. Case details, various intricate details about the case, if you only want cases involving the presence of urine within there. Practicing consultant, if you're only interested in the cases made by Foreman rather than Napier. Then our topics. And these are not mutually exclusive, so you can chain these together as much as you want. And this is just an example of the visualization facilities that we have. And this is actually a visualization if you search for all cases containing a medical topic. You can see a breakdown of what the percentage of the cases were by practitioner, by practice, and at the bottom there you can see what the frequency was. And then further down that same page, you actually find demographic breakdowns for all the patients in there. These are all generated dynamically on the site. You can find it online. Here's all the topics that would occur within cases that have a medical topic in them. And again, for sheer perversity, because I like this, because I have to deal with dynamically generated stuff all the time, if you clicked on symptoms, there's a breakdown of all the symptoms that would be contained within those cases. And you could do this search right now, and you would get pretty well that exact same display on the summarized page. Few differences since we're rolling some out in the next few weeks, but broadly speaking, that's what you'll get. But what's more important from our point of view is that we actually want to start exploring more of the connections that we have within the cases rather than simply visualize the statistics. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of personal information in there, a lot of relations noted, and what we want to do is to be able to explore these overlapping sets of networks, social, topical, cosmological, and follow them through. And these can all be reconstructed from the data that we have encoded. And right here, you see one that was made by one of our editors as a sample. And this was down in yellow. You'll see Elizabeth Hartwell, who was in the case. See John Ovedale up there. You can see all the servants. Our goal within the next year and a half or so is to actually be dynamically producing these on the site based on the searches that you're doing. And because of the way that we've actually recorded this information, not only is it possible for us to construct these relationships, we can also differentiate between different types of relationship. So you could show all the relationships, you could decide you just are interested in seeing familial relationships, or you could decide you just want to see familial and household relationships, or you could just want to see professional relationships, or any combination of those. This is all possible with what we've got already. And the final type of visualization that we're going to be doing within the next 2 years is actually geographical visualization. Again, this is another mock-up here, but we have recorded, wherever it's noted, the places in which people were from or consultations took place. And we're going to be mapping these onto appropriate 16th, early 17th century maps, like Wistow's map of London in the case of Foreman's cases, and Speed's map of the counties in the case of Napier's. And this actually brings me to the final point when we bring this up, is all this mapping here is feasible. It's stuff we can do with the data that we already have in there. And the problem that we face, and I think all the projects here face in the same way, is that we've got the capacity to visualize and create these complex networks of relationships, whether it's geographical networks, whether it's social networks, whether it's physical networks of items within an archive. We've got the capacity to do something with it. The problem is actually creating meaningful ways to present this information so researchers can actually use it. And what researchers need to be able to do is actually zoom into a network, pick up a thread that leads to another network. It could be one of a complete different type or one of the same type. So say you start off doing a search for medical cases. You find that interesting and you narrow it down, but you want to look on people who suffered from pain in the legs. So you zoom in on that. But then you decide, oh, that's interesting, but you suddenly decide, actually, I want to see what's going on geographically. Suddenly you're switching to a geographical context. Then you might want to zoom out a bit again and get rid of that subtopic you were looking at. Look at the full set again, but visualize things in terms of social relations. You know, these are all things that are possible. These are things that I think researchers tend to do a lot by hand. And the problem that we face in constructing these sorts of interfaces is not just creating an interface that allows people to do this sorts of explanation, but it's one that does not make it easy for them to get lost. And it's vital that we provide the capacity for this free exploration of the networks, but somehow we also need to provide prompts or information that allows them to maintain a situational awareness, not only of what they're currently looking at, but also what they were investigating when they started and the route that they took to get to where they are right now. And as I said, these are problems that aren't unique to us. I have absolutely no answers to these questions at all, other than knowing this is the problem that I'm going to be grappling with for the next 2 years. And I think probably the best way to wind up here would be to say, I hope in the Great British tradition, this is something we can perhaps talk about in the pub afterwards, and maybe come up with some solutions there.